So I am delighted to be joined today by Josie Goodall from Oxford University. Josie is going to be talking to us today about the foundations and adaptability of project management. This is actually the first of 3 other sessions that the PRISM group are organising. So we have, just for the dates for the diary, if you haven't already signed up, we have, I've lost my page. We have Stakeholder Mapping, that's going to be on the 10th of June, and then Risk and Change on the 15th of July. I'll put the link to those, it's on our website, but I'll put the link to those in the chat just in case anybody has missed those. But delighted to welcome everybody today. So please, Josie, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Oh, can you see my presentation?
Yep, we can. We can see that perfectly.
Brilliant.
Yep, we can see your presentation.
And go back to the beginning. So just to do some signposting at the beginning, I'm not trying to teach you about project management in this talk. I could do that, but when I was hired as a project coordinator 13 years ago for a research grant. And I was hired as a project coordinator because coordinators did things and managers told people what to do. And that's what my academics thought the difference between those 2 roles were. And I did a number of project management qualifications and I thought, oh, these are great, like really useful structures and tools. And then I found I never actually really used them quite as prescribed. So as I was writing this talk, I found it was more about signposting how research management is different from project management, but also how we can utilise their tools to make our lives hopefully slightly easier and slightly clearer. So I'll talk a bit about why research projects aren't just project management as usual. I will introduce a couple of project management methodologies, so the waterfall and the agile type methodologies, and then I'll talk a bit about what I think we need to be doing to set up research projects for success, some common failure points, and then sort of areas to monitor, and then a bit of pat on the back, so why we're all so essential and what we do is important. So this talk, we all come from different backgrounds, different departments, different scientific or research disciplines. We could be for HR events, procurement. I don't know about you, but I kind of fell into this role. I come from an academic background. I was a postdoc and I ended up kind of managing a big grant. And then somebody said, oh, there's this role that would be useful. And I took that sideways step. Many of us operate in teams that may do very different things from us. And many of us may operate with bosses or line managers who maybe don't necessarily know what our day-to-day role is. They just like to see the outputs. So I'm trying to signpost some things that are useful here. I'm not trying to tell you how to do your jobs or prescribe one particular methodology. So I would say research management falls into the cracks. It falls between sort of grant funding and institutions. It falls between academic and professional support or professional services. It falls between scientific curiosity and institutional compliance. And in that space, we have to make things work and make things go ahead. So in industry, if project management, if the manager says no, it's a process. But in research, if we say no, it's then a discussion with a world-leading expert who may just see management as red tape. So I say that we operate in the space between where research becomes deliverable or doesn't, and it's not always appreciated. So I'll move on now to what a project is. So traditional project management comes from sort of engineering, construction type background, where you have a known problem and a stable delivery condition normally, though at the moment in the current financial climate, the stable delivery is more of a uncertainty. But we have a scope, a time and a cost, and they are set at the beginning of a project and controlled together to give you the quality of project you need, and change is a risk or even potentially failure. And the outcomes are predictable to produce a known project, a building, a new aeroplane, something like that. But this doesn't always fit in research because research environments aren't so defined and the problems aren't defined. So in research projects, rather than scope, quality, time, I'd say we have funding cycles. So we have the cost would be the funding. We have people and capability, and then we have knowledge and discovery as the bounds of our projects. Our projects are collaborative and multi-partner. They often don't have a single defined authority point. The outputs are uncertain by design. We don't know what we're going to find out, so the scope is going to change as the project goes forward and changes information, which means that, as far as I've discovered in the last 13 years, that you can't just apply project management methodologies, but I will just go over a couple of methodologies, hopefully quite quickly. So in a traditional project, it has a very defined structure. You find a business need, you select your project, you define the boundaries of the project and what you want to achieve, you plan it all out, you do the project, you finish the project, and you learn what you can from it. So the sequence is authorize, plan and control, deliver, and then close. And many institutions sort of view this as a project and think this is how projects go ahead in research environments. And I would say, and hopefully you'll agree with me towards the end of this talk, that they don't. So in a traditional project, the initiation is whether the project should exist. This is the business case. And at this point, we define the feasibility and the viability, as well as what the outcome and success criteria should be. And we'll produce things like stakeholder maps, risk assessments, and the business case. In research, we're trying to win funding at this stage rather than prove operational feasibility. So it doesn't quite fit. But in a project, we then go on to planning, and we will set our planning and control mechanisms before the project starts. So our goal through all of this is to set our way forward and reduce the uncertainty. So we have detailed plans, schedules, and reporting structures. So these could be Gantt charts, critical path methods, RACI matrices, which I think will come up in one of the later talks, and you'll find out more about this and the risk as well. So RACI is responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed. So it's a map of who's doing what and who needs to know what. And it's only at this point, when we've planned the whole project, we've invested a whole lot in all the decision points, the milestones, the control, that we actually do the project. And the whole point of doing the project is to stick to the plan. So any variation from the plan is a problem, and everything the project manager is doing is trying to pull the trajectory of the project back to that baseline plan, or make a decision, make a change, replan, and go off on a new trajectory. But it's not to have unknown things happening. And we consume the resource as we deliver the project. Whereas research, I would say, is iterative and generative. So we generate new scope with new ideas and new questions rather than consuming it. So we consume the money and the time. And then at the end of a project, we close the project and we do our learning in traditional. So all the learning comes at the end, which doesn't fit research at all. But this is the sign off, the formal end. I mean, the project doesn't have to be successful at this point. You could close an unsuccessful project that has failed for one reason or another. In research, closure is normally because the funding has ended or there's administrative closure. But it's still valuable to have this process, and I'd say this is a key thing to learn from project management, is you want to capture your learning and your impact and your lessons throughout the project, but before everyone leaves. And in project management, you have a very clear hierarchy. You have a sponsor who owns the project. You have the project manager who facilitates the work and controls it. And then you have a stable team that executes it, and a range of stakeholders who are interested in the project for various reasons. The bit I like about most project management courses is you also have a project office who will help prepare documents and do support. And I don't know about you, but I've not had that in any of my roles. I would love a project office. Agile is slightly different. It arose from software environments where the end product isn't always known, but you know you want to produce something. So instead of fixing the scope like we do in a traditional project management, we work through feedback loops that define the next step and the next step to go forward. So in some ways, this is more like research in the fact that we don't know what we don't know and we have to find that out. But it does assume stable teams with authority and knowledge to go through all these cycles. So it's the same team throughout different projects and different cycles. The whole point of Agile is that if it goes wrong, you fail fast and you don't waste a lot of resource. But it does accept that there is some uncertainty in the project. So in some respects, Agile methodologies do fit research a little better than maybe the traditional does. But I don't think we can simply do Scrum for research or Scrum for science. So in an Agile project, we set up a vision statement. So this is what we want to do and what value are we trying to create. And this, unlike traditional project management, isn't a 50-page business case with everything written out. It's just why are we doing this? We then set up what in Agile we call the backlog. We'd probably call it a to-do list. So this is all the work items and tasks that need to be created, but we haven't given them a date at this point. And then we set up a definition of done for the first stage. So where do we want to get to in a cycle? And at this point, we would have a roadmap, our vision statement and a definition of done, and we would assemble our team. We then move into our cycles, or our sprints as they're called in Agile. And this is a repetitive process of analysing where we are and what we need to do, prioritising the tasks and the scope we're going to do in this one small section. We then develop and execute, and in a software setting, this would be a prototype. We then test it, we validate it with users and feedback. And at that stage, we have a sprint review. We'll review where we are and where we want to go, what direction. And then we go round again. So we review what we've learned in the last and where we are, what our backlog is, so our to-do list, and what we're going to do in this next cycle. And we go round and round again. And at each stage, we review the lessons learned. The structure of Agile is a little less hierarchical in the fact that you have a project owner who owns the final deliverable, a Scrum Master, and I have visions of rugby every time I hear Scrum Master, and sometimes in project management I do feel like that. And then we have a stable delivery team and our stakeholders, and the delivery team has a lot more authority. The goal of the project manager or the Scrum Master is to facilitate the team to do their job, so they are more empowered rather than to direct them. So this Agile seems to fit research a bit better than project management, but research often operates in sort of more fragmented control systems and more uncertain or more diverse. So we're not creating one single product. So just comparing the three, I will share these slides. I have sent them to Katie, and as it's been recorded, I'm not going to read all this. But I think the key differences is traditional project management or waterfall project management is about control. You are controlling everything possible so that you don't divert from your plan. Agile is about change, but research is about discovery. So we are constantly, rather than working to a product, we are discovering new items. So in research, rather than either a fixed scope or an emergent scope, we need a bounded scope where we know what we want to do and the limits of what we want to do, but we don't know how we're going to move around in that space. We need to manage the change rather than control it. And when we're working to a plan, we need to work towards the outputs rather than fixed steps. But it is important that we have people and that we know what we're doing now in this grant. And for example, where project management might have a fixed product and Agile is looking to deliver the value that we've assigned in the project and the vision. Research, we could discover all sorts of things, but we might have to defer them for future funding rather than this project. So the discovery leads to value that may not be realised in this project, but may lead to other projects. So this is sort of trying to show that research sits in a structurally different environment from either Agile or traditional project management, waterfall project management. And so we need to use the tools, but moderate them. So research is discovery driven. We are working, I've used this phrase throughout the project, influence without authority. So we have the PI of the project, you have the university governance, you have your funders' expectations, and then we have the research manager who's trying to facilitate things to happen, but may not have sort of the authority of the PI or the university, and that outputs are emerging, they're not executed. We do have fixed funding, and our accountability is to the funders. We have to fit their funding conditions, but also teams might be across institutions, they might be global. So this is very different from sort of a stable team that's pulled together to do a project. When we are setting up a research project, this is normally the grant writing stage. So there's a scientifically valuable idea that may go through some internal processes, but that might be as simple as the research project office agreeing the funding is reasonable. Some of them, like the Future Leaders projects, have only 1 or 2 per institution go forward, so there's an internal sifting there. But the award is external, and it's externally competitive as well. The research ambition set out in the grant can change, and often sort of innovation or, oh, I wonder what happens if we do this, could create something that's very exciting, and the PA may pivot away from the grant, and we have to look into the reality and the impact of that on the funding and the funders' conditions. In traditional project management, the authority is clear and defined, it's written down, the roles are assigned, whereas authority is distributed. But the key difference, I would say, is that funding does not equal feasibility. When a project is set up, that project is feasible. In the initiation and planning, we define the feasibility of that project. When a scientist writes the grant proposal, it doesn't mean because they get money, it can be done. And so the research manager's job, if there is a research manager, is to take what's written on that paper and turn it into a practical way forward. And it's vital at this stage to clarify what cannot change versus what can. What are the decision routes, and the assumptions and the reporting rhythms. So how frequently do you have to report to the funders? How frequently do you need to capture your learnings and review progress? Also need to capture what's been assumed. So have we assumed we can get access to a certain facility in the grant, and is that reality? Or have we assumed there's a certain postdoc with a certain amount of knowledge that will be coming onto the project, and actually because of the time taken to get the grant they've left? So we need to define those assumptions and see how they affect the project. And we need to communicate. The alignment between the PI and the research manager is critical. Now, the one thing I'd say at this point is often the funding for the research manager is on the grant. So we have missed all this stage and have to backtrack and clarify based on what's written on the grant and what's in the PI's head, what's actually going to happen. And I think that's a critical stage, especially if we are coming in after the funded decision, to make sure that we know what the assumptions about our role and how the project is going to be conducted are done. So I'd say communication is probably the biggest thing that leads to feasibility. Setting up a research project is a shared system. So it's not just the project owner and the project manager. You have the academics who define the scientific ambition. You have the funders who give you the constraints and the accountability. You have your university, which controls the government's risk frameworks, and in some cases what you can and can't do to a certain extent. And then you have the managers who have to then integrate all this and align the expectations. If the expectations between all those partners are misaligned, it can create projects further down the line. And the key role that we have as research managers is to translate. So we have to translate the academic speak into funder speak. So the ambition and the discovery into milestones and impact, and then also into university speak of compliance, risk and money. And vice versa. The outputs, I'd say, of an effective research project is structural clarity. So we need to define what our assumptions are, what the scope is, what the limits of the scope is, so what can be done and what can't be done, what's outside of the scope of this project and outside of the funders' expectations, and what the success criteria are, so that everybody has those at the top of their lists and is clear on them. There's practical foundations, so we need some sort of delivery roadmap. Now, a 50-page Gantt chart of what we're going to do may be in the grant. It's normally 2 pages for UKRI, but as soon as a bit of kit breaks or someone leaves, that Gantt chart is now sort of useless or out of alignment. So rather than a whole list of tasks and milestones, we need sort of a guide. So a roadmap rather than a GPS. We're not looking at every turn we're going to take, but we need to know the direction we're trying to get to. We do need to be realistic about resource, especially at the moment. Funding is becoming tighter and tighter. And so we need to know what the money has been assigned for and where the critical points are. We need some idea of risk and how the decisions are going to be made and how any changes are going to be controlled, documented, communicated. And then who cares? Who's responsible? Who's accountable? Who has influence? And then we need to assign work with all the stakeholders and the reporting requirements from the funders, any facility requirements, any collaborators, the general public, and make sure there's alignment and agreement there and that things are explicit and not assumed. So the tools I would say that are really important is our stakeholder mapping. If you don't know who has an influence on the project and how they have that influence, you don't know who to communicate to. So this obviously is the academics and the funders and institutions, but it could be the general public. It could be companies, it could be collaborators. And it's important to know how they influence the project so we know what they need to know at any point. And the stakeholder mapping can actually lead to quite a useful communication plan, and there's no point in sending the general public a board report every year that's 50 pages, but a web page, a tweet, it could be quite useful. So having this stakeholder mapping can guide your communication plan going forward and help you with your reviews, capturing your learning, because you know who needs to know what when. We need a high level scope definition, so what's in and what's out, at least this funding round. And that's one of the tools that I would take from Agile as the now next later funder framework, which we're going to do this now. We'll leave that for later, whether that's a later Scrum in Agile or a later grant in research. And then how are we going to start? We need to know the initial steps. Responsibility mapping is very important. So who decides what, who delivers what, and who supports? And the one thing I'd say here is if you don't get it agreed, people are going to assume it's your responsibility. That's one thing I found working with academics. They will assume you can do everything and will do everything. So for the sake of your sanity, getting some sort of responsibility mapping and agreement of who does what is very important. And the line at the bottom is if it isn't written down, it will drift, is I think important to remember. So if it isn't explicit and everybody understands it, people will go off in different directions and assume different things. So having these tools in place is more about clarity than control. We're not trying to force the project, we're just trying to define it and direction it so everyone's going together. Now there are situations where you can plug and play the project management methodologies. I don't tend to find this works for the whole project, but for example, if you are organising an event that is a defined product with a deadline, normally have a budget, there's normally a PI who could be the project manager who is responsible for the overall feel and direction of the project, and you can pretty much assign tasks, have a team working on that, you have a deadline. And so a waterfall or traditional project management would fit quite well with that. For something like a paper, Agile works quite well. So you would have experimental cycles where you do a scientific experiment, you review what you've learned, you do another scientific experiment, you review what you've learned to prove your research hypothesis for that paper. You would then analyse those researches and you write up, you review, you edit, and in the end you have a paper. You know what the value of the paper was because that's your hypothesis. But for the whole scope of the project, I would say you can't plug and play project management. We can steal their tools though. And so here's a list of tools in project management or Agile. I've created a list of what they are and what the key feature is, and then how we can adapt them for research. So the scope statement, rather than a fixed document that's locked in, controlled and set in stone, we have a bounded scope that we revisit and review in line with the funder requirements. For the risks, rather than just being risks about the delivery and the product, we have to look into the scientific risks, the people risks, delivery risks, and compliance. Instead of the definition of done we have in Agile, we would have research questions. And instead of a backlog of prioritised features, we would have research tasks. For the RACI, for the responsible authority consulted or informed maps, which are very useful, you need to consider not just the hierarchy and who does what, but also who's influence. It may be a postdoc or a PhD student in the lab who knows one bit of kit. So they will have the most influence over that task, and it's their time, rather than, for example, the PI or whoever it says is the technician in the lab or might on paper have that authority. I do have one note on AI. I am not an expert at AI, but I do believe we can't avoid it. Or, I mean, we can avoid it, but I think it would be detrimental to do so. So AI, they're used increasingly in research environments. For me, I find them quite useful in drafting and in summarising, structurising, or supporting documentation. It's quite useful to get over the blank page, but it is very important to note that AI lacks any context or nuance or institutional understanding. And it's also worth thinking about where the models came from. If you're asking for project management type questions, is the data AI working from going to be traditional project management, and is it going to fit what you're doing? So I'd say AI supports your judgment, but it shouldn't be used for decision making. Somebody once said to me that AI is a bit like an intern. They're very enthusiastic, convinced that they know what they're doing and confident, and they can be very convincingly wrong. So it's worth keeping that in mind if you use AI. But for example, this is a prompt that someone used to create a project, and it will come up with a fairly sensible project plan. You just then need to see if it's actually sensible for your project, and you need to use your experience and your judgment. And I think that's where our value comes from, where AI is taking some of the mundane tasks like writing a document, but it's writing a document with the right information, and that right information is in our experience. So I titled this project slide Managing Large Grants Without Losing Your Mind, because we end up often managing more and more. If you want something done, ask a busy person. And for research management, that means we have to adjust how we're thinking. And the way I look at this is rather than looking at projects or individual tasks, we need to start looking at processes and patterns in the projects rather than individual tasks. We need to track the capabilities. So where are the skills? Who's stretched? Who's stressed? Who's at risk of leaving? What's happening to that knowledge if they are leaving? I mean, there's a saying, guns don't kill people, people kill people. In project management, it's milestones don't deliver projects, people deliver projects. So if your project is leveraged on one postdoc and they get offered their dream job and leave and take all their knowledge with you, how does that affect, and how can we manage that? The other point is we have a grant, we have a fixed budget, so we need to be realistic about the money, and hopefully the research project office has helped with that. But the point here is that if you align the spend to the scientific uncertainty and create a buffer where progress is least certain, it can support working across multiple projects rather than trying to micromanage the finance. Working without a big team, prioritisation becomes essential. We have to learn what we can and can't do. And again, the not now and later framework is quite useful for our jobs, not just the projects. And saying no is a skill. Having templates and routines, and hopefully some of the tools I've mentioned here may not have been known to you and become useful. But I would say the key thing is relationships. Knowing who to ask and who can help is essential, and also the trust. If there's the support, having the permission to drop some admin, so having that explicit role clarity and support is useful. And then focusing through the tools and the documents that you've created on the leverage points. Where are the critical points where either decisions have to be made or more management is needed because there's more uncertainty, is very useful. And I would say there's two things to take from project management here: that good enough is good enough, and perfection is the enemy of progress. So in project management, your scope doesn't mean perfection, it means where you stop. It is impossible to do everything perfectly, and if you try, you're at risk of either burnout or role dilution. And it is difficult in research management roles because I find there's very high expectations, but often low visibility of all the stuff we do. There's often all the things that we do in the background to make research happen. No one else necessarily knows what we're doing. We just do it. Common pitfalls in research. The scope tends to drift because in research projects, the scope is not fixed, and the whole point of the project is that the outcomes are uncertain. We have to discover them. If expectations are misaligned, that can cause problems. And if communication is broken down, so silence, if things just happen and nobody knows that they're happening, that will cause problems. So these are things to watch out for in projects. So scope, creep or drift. We have to bound the difference between scientifically valuable and fundable, but also scientifically valuable to this project and interesting. So we need to keep an eye on the impact and feasibility and the funders' requirements. And also saying not now does not equal saying no. And there is a now versus next grant decision. But it is important, on the bottom line of the image, we have curiosity leading to drift, which leads to risk and escalation. But instead, if we have curiosity and change and make a decision and document it, we can stick to the alignment of the requirements of the project. And the tools from project management are sort of change requests, change logs, and keeping an eye and revisiting the scope statement. Risk. In project management, uncertainty is an issue and a failure, whereas in science it's expected, or in research, sorry, I come from a science background, so this talk was originally written for science. It's important to revisit your risks, and risk registers should be updated. For example, when COVID happened, it completely changed the research environment for a year or two, and the risks of those projects would have completely changed. And at that point, you need to look at your risks and reassess them so that you can manage them. And I think one of the talks later is about risk registers, so I'm not going to go into any detail on this. I will say projects rarely fail because the research was wrong, or the PI wasn't brilliant, or even necessarily that the research manager wasn't fully competent. Research fails because people don't talk to each other. Things change without anyone know about it, or anyone following up on it, or managing it. So the silence between different people on a project is one of the things. And also knowledge loss. A big risk in science is people leaving and knowledge going with them. When I was hired for my first project coordinator job, somebody turned around to me and said, "Welcome to herding cats." To which I went, "Oh my gosh, what have I agreed to do?" But I think it is important to recognise that we often have a large degree of responsibility, but we may not necessarily have the authority on paper. So our job is managing up, managing down, and managing sideways to translate between people. We need to pick our battles and understand what's motivating people and their bias and goals. One of the things that it's worth considering is that maybe PIs don't need a manager, but they do need a wingman who's going to see the obstacles that they are too busy to notice that could sink their projects. And this requires trust and understanding and communication. We all want projects that finish well and not just finish. We don't want to just get to the end of the grant and everything gets shelved. In science, success doesn't mean no problems. I think research sort of solves problems, but we have to manage the complexity of those problems within the bounds of our projects. And projects will develop new scopes and new funding, new thoughts, so we need to capture the outputs and the learnings from the projects and not just get to the end of the grant and finish. As research managers, our work is often unseen, but is mission critical. We provide relationship networks, we possibly provide continuity across funding cycles, and we are sort of the glue that hold projects together. I have tried to summarise everything that I've said in one picture, and I used AI to create this because I'm not that good at PowerPoint. But I've tried to sort of show here that rather than having a fixed structure or a fixed procedure, we are anchoring what has to be kept compliant with the funder's rules, with budgets, while enabling the scientific direction by using minimum governance and reporting, watching the risks and measuring what matters. So our input, our follow-on funding, the publications, collaborations. Essential tools: decision clarity, who decides what assumptions we have, what must be true, what could change, what the scope is, so what's in and what's out, what's nice and essential, what's a bit of a stretch, what do we depend on, what people, facilities, and what are the blockers, what does success look like, what's going to make the funders happy, and what scientifically are we trying to discover, and then the now, next, later. So what are we delivering now, what can we park to explore next, and what should be in future funding. So my takeaway is that we are not project management. Research project management or research management is a distinct discipline, and it's a hybrid approach that's not a compromise. And you may actually be using more project management tools than you think, and that our professional judgment and experience makes complex research deliverable. So thank you, and are there any questions?
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. I think everyone, just from the comments there, just really what you've been saying has really resonated with everybody. So thank you again. If people are happy to come on and ask a question, they're very welcome to do so. You can just raise your hand, or you can just pop it into the chat function, whatever you would like. Do we have any questions? Well, can I be cheeky then, saying there's a silence and we don't have any questions? Closing out the project was one of the things that you mentioned, one of the major risks with people leaving, the institutional knowledge being lost. Do you have any tips or hints on how you've been able to manage that?
Yes. So the Catalysis Hub that I work in now is a multi-institutional research grant, and so we have students and postdocs who come from anywhere from 6 weeks, 1 day, to 3 years. And so we, around, for example, because I do science research, a lot of the institutional knowledge is around how to operate bits of kit. So we always have a senior postdoc or a senior PhD student and a new coming PhD student, and we try and pass that training along so that we have then recorded responsibilities, training, and so that it's not getting to 3 years and someone's leaving and then we're like, oh shoot. So we have a procedure in place basically to try and pass that critical knowledge on, and that's about being aware of what those key points are and that key knowledge. And then always, I mean, you can't avoid it all, you can't avoid all loss, but where you know, if you've mapped those decision points and that responsibility, you can then manage that and train sort of in cycles to keep that in-house.
That's great, thank you. I see Tom has his hand up. Tom, go on ahead with your question.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, thank you, Jess. That was really a great session. Resonated with a lot of those things you pointed out. Just one question. You mentioned on one of your slides that failure is structural, not personal. Could you just clarify a little bit more what you meant by that, given that you've already stressed that often it's the communications and people skills that are the critical things?
Yeah, so most projects, I think, fail because the expectations drift. So, I mean, from a funder's point of view, that would be that the PI's discovered something and gone off down that track and not told the funders. So what they're looking into is not what's been funded. Or the knowledge is lost and you can't do the techniques that you put into the grant anymore, or a facility closes, a bit of kit breaks, and if that's not communicated, and so the I don't know, the mass spec has broken, the PhD student's gone, oh well, I can't use that, I'm going to do this instead, and goes off in a different direction, and then 6 months down the line the PI goes, right, I want the results, and the PhDs will have done this instead, and if that's not been communicated, that can cause failures to what you have to deliver. And so it's that sort of uncommunicated change that causes, I think, failure of the process, rather than you've not been a good manager or the PI wasn't a brilliant scientist.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you, that helps. Thanks, Josie.
Thank you, Tom. There's a couple of questions here. Oh, sorry. Yep, Melanie, do you want to jump in there?
Thank you, Josie. I really enjoyed your talk. My question, I don't know if you can answer it because you are from a scientific background. I was just asking, for people who are not from a scientific background, do you have any advice on how they would go about undertaking a role maybe in a more scientific area? I'm currently working in digital health technology, which is not my background. I'm actually a linguist, but a lot of the skills that you spoke about are skills that I have and have developed over time. I mean, and sometimes there is that you do feel as if you really are the layperson in the room, as if you don't understand what's being said. So I just wondered if there was any way to kind of bridge that gap.
Yeah, and I'd say, I mean, all the tools and the processes I've talked about in this talk are probably discipline ambivalent, like anyone can use them. The hardest thing coming into a room is the translation. So it's translating what the scientist is finding in the lab into what the general public needs to know, or the funder needs to know, or writing an article on the impact. And that's where the relationships come into it, I'd say. It's knowing who can help with that translation until you get a bit more background knowledge. And if you work in one field for long enough, you'll pick it up, but I'm not necessarily saying that's a good thing. So it's about being able to have friendly postdocs or professors or lecturers who can help you translate the really nitty-gritty paper into, or just talk to you about it, talk you through it, so that you can then write something that's engaging and interesting, or report on it, or know what they're doing. And so I'd say the relationship management then becomes even more critical, and knowing who can do what. And it's the hardest thing I found with moving institutions, is knowing who to contact to do this. Who's in finance that can help me with this? Who's in procurement? Who's in HR? And so when you move into new roles, that's kind of, I think, one of the early essential steps is finding those relationships and making those friends. And for those working remotely, it's even harder, and you have to work a bit more on those networks.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a great question. Thank you. Amanda, do you want to jump in? And then we have 2 or 3 in the chat that I'd like to try to get through. So Amanda, go on ahead.
Hi, Josie. I haven't
Hi,
seen you in a
Amanda.
while. Great question for you. So you talk about, obviously, we do have to anticipate for change, and we might have risk registers and all of that, but sometimes changes come thick and fast, and they might not be on your risk register. And I don't know if you've encountered ways to handle such kind of large amounts of change, because sometimes it can be really almost like you can get to a point of like burnout if there's not a way to handle that. And I just didn't know if you had any kind of thoughts on ways to manage those situations, which I hope other people don't deal with all the time, but we do occasionally.
I think, I mean, the pandemic is obviously the example of everything changing at once, but it's like, as a research manager, you could have 3 new grants come in and have to be suddenly managing 3 new projects at different stages, or the academic could decide they want to do something completely different. People leave, people get hired, kit breaks, and it always happens at once. It's sod's law. Prioritization, delegation, and we may not have teams, but hopefully we have those networks around us that we can say, can you find out about that, or can you help? And having those reciprocal networks, and then having the processes in place so you can get the overview, and that you're not in the nitty gritty and micromanaging everything would be the key things. Work-life balance helps. And I know it's not necessarily a project management tool, but being able to shut down the laptop and walk away for a few hours is vitally important, and often very difficult if people feel like their research, their work, their area is the end of the world, or solving all the world's problems, or even just someone so passionate that you don't want to let them down. But it's very important to protect not only the project's boundaries, but your own boundaries.
Comes back to sort of what you were saying about being able to say no,
Yeah, or not now.
Not now, yeah.
Sorry, this is next on my list.
Josie. I don't want to rush you, but we've got one here from Nicola, who was saying, thank you so much for this. I feel seen. One of the most substantial obstacles I've encountered is a lack of alignment between co-PIs. Do you, or does anyone have any strategies for influencing consensus to arrive at a place of clarity on the overall project direction?
It's a difficult one because personalities. A lot of it is about managing expectations and maintaining communication pathways. So if you have a bounded and revisited project statement, you can go back to that. And again, setting priorities and having the now, next, later. So if one PI wants to go this way and one co-I wants to go another way, but the project says you're going to do this, saying, well, let's try this, and then we'll look into that later, maybe a way of getting them all going in the same direction.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Got another one here from Louise, and Louise is coming from a pre-award standpoint, working in a team that puts together grant application. What would be the key ask from us that would make the role of research project managers easier? That's an interesting one. And do you think that moving forward, a blended team of pre and post-award project managers would actually be like a superpower when it comes to academic research management?
I mean, I was very excited when I discovered some institutions have a office of research managers, like a PRISM office. I thought that was the most amazing thing, because having more people who understand what you're doing and can step in or help or have a cup of tea and bitch about academics is very important. So I think that would help. I think it's very difficult to say exactly what could be done to help, because a lot of what's set in the grant from pre-award is set by the funders. So without changing what the funders want, so the funders want a Gantt chart, they want a delivery plan, which may not be useful. And a lot of funders feel that a project should be a project management project, and they should progress along those sort of structured lines, and it just doesn't. So I think sort of in terms of pre-award, it's just the communication with if there are research managers, and having that blended would be really useful, because you could discuss. Whereas I think a lot of the issues come when the project manager is then hired after the grant, on the grant, and you have to sort of work backwards rather than making progress to get everything in place.
Yeah.
So having, at the pre-award stage, having someone who sort of could spend a minimal amount of time creating some of these processes that I've talked about, so having sort of a high level scope statement and some decision points set up, without sort of, I'm not suggesting spending hours and hours on it, but having those documents or templates ready to go with the project would be useful.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. We have a few more questions in the chat there, but I'm conscious that we're 2 minutes at the end of the meeting, and I think we've tortured you enough. I will take a note of these questions and fire them off into an email, just as I said to you at the start. And if you wouldn't mind, if you could just provide a few lines, then I can pop them back out to the people who have asked the questions. All that is left for me to do is just a massive thank you to Josie. I thought that was brilliant, really interesting. I think, as I said to you, there's a huge amount of interest in your next 2 sessions as well. I think they're really valuable. And really
just
useful.
To say, I am not the speaker in the next 2 sessions. There's 2 other very excellent people who are giving those talks. I hope to attend the sessions, but I'm getting married in June, so I may miss that one.
Congratulations. Oh, that's lovely. Well, yes, you could do this, and now that's you done. That's you done. Yes.
I think we do have a panel discussion at the end, though.
I think so, yes. I can't actually remember, but I can pop the link in the chat for everybody, and hopefully if people aren't registered, please, I would encourage you to do so. As I said at the start as well, we'll have a short feedback form and I'll circulate that around. But massive thanks, and all the very best for the wedding. I hope that all goes well and you get some lovely weather for it. But thanks again, and thanks everybody for attending. Have a great afternoon.